Betrayal is a word that feels too weak when the wound is so deep. It's like being stabbed in the back by someone whose hand you trusted. They twist the knife slowly, and the pain isn't just physical. It's emotional, it's mental, it's spiritual. That's what I was feeling the moment I saw my boyfriend, Jake, in bed with my mother. I never thought it could happen to me. Who does? We're always told to watch out for betrayal from friends or coworkers. But from your mother? From the person you thought loved you more than anything in the world. That kind of betrayal feels like a poison that spreads slowly until it consumes every part of you. But maybe I should start from the beginning. I'm 25 years old. For the most part, life has treated me well. I work at the hotel my mother owns, the Sapphire Palace, one of the most luxurious hotels in the city. It wasn't easy growing up in a wealthy family, despite what people might think. My parents divorced when I was 18, and that split took a heavy toll on me. While I didn't speak to my father anymore, my relationship with my mother was complicated, to say the least. She had always been distant, more focused on her image and the success of her hotel than on being a mother. But I never relied on her. Despite working in her hotel, I had earned everything I had on my own. I lived independently, paid my own bills, and even put myself through school without dipping into my mother's fortune. And though I loved my job at the hotel, it was often a reminder of the fractured relationship between us. Still, the one thing I could always rely on was my hotel team. We had a close-knit crew, and despite the high-end clientele and constant pressure, we managed to have fun. One of the more elegant features of the Sapphire Palace was its French restaurant, La Vie en Rose. It was a beautiful space with plush red booths, chandeliers that glistened like jewels, and live piano music in the evenings. That's where I met Jake. Jake was the restaurant's pianist, a gorgeous man with a brooding yet gentle demeanor. His fingers glided over the keys with ease, and whenever he played, the room seemed to pause just to listen. I had noticed him long before we ever spoke. He was tall, with wavy black hair that always seemed perfectly tousled, and a jawline that could cut glass. He had a quiet charm that pulled me in, and soon I made it my goal to capture his attention. It worked. Slowly but surely, Jake and I became closer. It started with casual conversations after his sets, then coffee dates, and finally we became a couple. I thought I had finally found someone who truly understood me, someone who didn't care about my family's money or status. He cared about me, or so I thought. The hotel was celebrating its 10th anniversary, a big corporate event, with all the major players from the hospitality industry in attendance. It was a night of celebration, of toasts, and a chance for my mother to flaunt her success. The ballroom was decorated in shimmering blues and silvers, and there were champagne fountains and gourmet food stations set up around the room. Jake had been asked to play piano during the event, and I remember watching him from across the room as he sat at the baby grand, fingers moving gracefully across the keys. He caught my eye and smiled, that same charming smile that had always made my heart flutter. I mingled with guests, made small talk with investors and colleagues, but something felt off. My mother had been acting strange all evening, more distant than usual. I had seen her glance at Jake a few times, which wasn't unusual. Jake was attractive, and women often stared at him, but something about the way she looked at him tonight made me feel uneasy. As the evening wore on, and the champagne flowed freely, I noticed that both Jake and my mother had disappeared from the ballroom. It wasn't unusual for Jake to take breaks, but I hadn't seen my mother leave the event, and I wondered where she had gone. It wasn't until I passed the reception desk and saw the check for the presidential suite that everything started to click. The suite had been reserved in my mother's name, as it often was for special guests, but what caught my eye was the order. Champagne and a fruit platter. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread, convincing myself that I was overreacting, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. But some terrible, gnawing instinct pushed me to follow my suspicions. I asked one of the waiters to bring up the fruit and champagne, offering to take it myself. My hands shook as I wheeled the cart down the hall toward the suite, my heart pounding in my chest. With every step, I could feel the dread growing stronger. When I finally reached the door of the presidential suite, I hesitated. My hands trembled as I knocked, waiting for a response. There was none. The door wasn't locked. I pushed it open slowly, stepping into the dimly lit room. The suite was stunning, with its plush furniture and sweeping views of the city, but I barely noticed any of it. My eyes were drawn to the bed. There, lying under the satin sheets, was Jake, shirtless, tangled in the covers, and next to him, wearing nothing but a silk robe, was my mother. The world seemed to tilt, the air leaving my lungs as the reality of what I was seeing settled in. My body went cold, my mind numb. I wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Jake's eyes opened, and when he saw me standing there, a look of shock spread across his face. My mother didn't even flinch. She just sat up slowly, adjusting the robe as if she hadn't been caught in the middle of the most despicable act of betrayal. I stood there, frozen, as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The two people I had trusted most had destroyed me. I left the hotel that night, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel of my car. The streets outside blurred into streaks of light as I sped away from everything, from my home, my mother, my boyfriend, my life. I didn't know where I was going, and I didn't care. I just needed to get away. When I finally stopped, it was in front of an old diner on the outskirts of town. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring at the neon sign blinking through the rain-streaked windshield. My heart pounded in my chest, and my thoughts raced in a dizzying spiral of anger, pain, and confusion. How could they do this to me? Why would they betray me like this? I spent the next few days in a fog, avoiding phone calls from my mother and ignoring every message from Jake. I couldn't face them. I couldn't face the truth. I holed up in my apartment, drowning in a sea of hurt and disbelief. The world felt darker now, colder. I had trusted them both, given them my love, and they had ripped it away from me without a second thought. But I couldn't stay hidden forever. Days turned into weeks, and the shock of that night slowly began to fade, replaced by a burning need for answers. I had to know why my mother, who had never shown me any real affection, would do this to me. Why Jake, who I thought truly loved me, would betray me so easily. I started digging, asking questions around the hotel, trying to piece together the events that led to that night. I didn't trust my mother to give me the truth, and I certainly didn't trust Jake. But there were others, employees who had been around for years, people who had seen things and heard things. It was then that I uncovered a truth far more sinister than I had ever imagined. Jake and my mother. Their affair hadn't just started that night. It had been going on for months, maybe even a year. They had been sneaking around behind my back, laughing at my ignorance, all while pretending to care about me. But it wasn't just about love or lust. There was something more. I started noticing discrepancies in the hotel's finances, money disappearing in small amounts over time. It didn't take long for me to realize that Jake wasn't just after me. He was after the hotel, and my mother had been helping him. They were planning something big. I could feel it in the air, the way they were avoiding me, the way they still worked together despite everything. There was something else going on, something darker than just an affair, and I was going to find out what it was. I couldn't do this alone. As much as I hated the idea of involving anyone else, I needed help. That's when I reached out to Emily, my childhood friend, and one of the only people I trusted. Emily had grown up in the same circles as me, but unlike most people in my life, she had no interest in the family fortune. She had always been more interested in people, how they worked, how they thought. She had become a private investigator a few years ago, and though we had drifted apart, I knew she could help. When I told her everything, her face remained calm, but I could see the flicker of anger in her eyes. "They're not just after you," she said. "They're after your legacy." With Emily's help, I started to unravel the tangled web of lies my mother and Jake had spun. I learned that Jake had been using me to get closer to my mother's business, feeding her information about me, all while slowly manipulating the hotel's finances in their favor. They were planning to take control of everything, the Sapphire Palace and its assets. But it wasn't just the betrayal that haunted me. It was the darkness I began to uncover about Jake. His shady past, his connections to dangerous people, and a trail of deceit that stretched far beyond our relationship. He wasn't just a pianist with a charming smile. He was a con man, a predator who had targeted my family for reasons I didn't yet understand. The more I learned, the more dangerous things became. I started noticing people following me, strange phone calls in the middle of the night, threats that made my blood run cold. Jake was trying to cover his tracks, and he wasn't going to let me stop him. Emily and I knew we had to act fast. We needed proof, something that could expose Jake and my mother for what they were doing, and we needed to stop them before they could carry out their plan. As we dug deeper, we discovered documents, hidden bank accounts, secret meetings, and plans for a hostile takeover of the hotel. It was all there, laid out in black and white. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. I found an old journal in my mother's study, hidden beneath stacks of papers. It wasn't hers, though. It belonged to my father, the father I hadn't spoken to in years. As I read through its pages, I began to realize that this betrayal had been in the works for far longer than I had thought. Jake wasn't the first man my mother had used to manipulate the people around her. She had done the same thing to my father, slowly driving a wedge between us, turning me against him, all to ensure that she remained in control. She had orchestrated the entire divorce, pushing my father out of our lives and cutting him off from the family fortune. I felt sick. This wasn't just about Jake. This was about power, control. My mother had been pulling the strings for years, and I had been nothing but a pawn in her game. With the journal and the documents in hand, Emily and I knew we had everything we needed to take them down. But we had to be careful. Jake and my mother weren't going to go down without a fight, and I knew they were capable of anything. We planned to confront them at the hotel, in the very place where the betrayal had begun. Emily and I arrived just as the sun was setting, the golden light casting long shadows across the grand entrance of a sapphire palace. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as we stepped inside. This was it, the final act. We found them in the restaurant, sitting at a table near the piano where Jake had once played. They looked so confident, so sure of themselves, like they had already won. But they didn't know what was coming. I approached the table, my hands shaking with adrenaline, and laid the documents in front of them. "I know everything," I said, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at me. My mother's face went pale, and Jake's smile faltered for the first time. "You think you can get away with this?" I asked, my voice rising. "You think you can destroy my life and just walk away?" For a moment there was silence. Then my mother stood, her face twisted in anger. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she hissed. "You've always been weak. You don't have what it takes to run this hotel. Jake and I, we're doing what needs to be done." But I wasn't weak anymore. Just as the confrontation reached its peak, there was a loud crash from the back of the restaurant. We all turned in shock as the doors burst open and a group of police officers entered the room, followed closely by my father. It was Emily who had called them, arranging for my father to finally return and expose the truth. The journal had given us the leverage we needed, and my father had been more than willing to help. As the police arrested Jake and my mother, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. It wasn't just the end of their scheme. It was the end of a lifetime of manipulation and deceit. My mother looked at me one last time as they led her away, her eyes filled with hatred. But I didn't care. I was finally free. In the weeks that followed, I took over the running of the Sapphire Palace. It wasn't easy. The hotel had been tarnished by scandal, and there was a lot of work to be done to rebuild its reputation. But I wasn't alone. With Emily's help and the support of my father, I began to rebuild both the hotel and my life. I learned to trust again, though it took time, and though the scars of betrayal would never fully fade, I knew I was stronger for it. Jake and my mother were gone, their plans unraveled, their lies exposed. But I had survived, and I would continue to thrive. As I stood on the balcony of the hotel one evening, watching the sun set over the city, I realized that the worst betrayals weren't the ones that came from enemies. They were the ones that came from those you loved the most. But betrayal didn't define me. I did,